Good morning. First of all, I can see my panelists. This is the first time I've met a couple of you. Welcome. My name is Karen Ross, and I'm Secretary of the California Department of Food and Agriculture. And I just want to thank everyone who has made this summit happen. I'm so excited for next year when we're in person. But one of the things I love about doing virtual meetings is that we can be truly international in our scope and in the expertise that we're going to hear from today. So I'm going to make some quick introductions of my panel members, and then we're just going to have a dialogue. I've got some questions for them. We've got wonderful expertise here, and it's a great way to kick off the day. I also want to thank Michael for his little TED Talk opening. I'm going to call it a TED Talk. I can see it going virtual, Michael. Planet Smart Dairy is right on, and we're all thrilled to be a part of it. And I can't start with my introductions unless I first thank the dairy families of California. It's been a challenge all along the way since that legislation passed, SB 1383. But once it was in effect, our dairy families stepped up and they're leading the way on methane reduction. And it's so proud for me to be a small part of the work that they do. So I'm going to pull rank and first introduce my good friend, Jenny Lester Moffett. Jenny is currently the Undersecretary for the United States Department of Agriculture for Marketing and Regulatory Programs. I had the great pleasure of working with Jenny for 7 years when she was at the Department of Food and Agriculture, first as Deputy Secretary and then Undersecretary. But I got to know her during the 10 years tenure where she was overseeing her family's organic walnut farm and processing business. Jenny, great to have you here. We're really looking forward to that USDA perspective. Next, I would like to introduce Donald Moore. Donald is he's got a long resume, and he's the person that's really leading the charge on fixing climate change for all of us. He's currently the executive director of the Global Dairy Platform, which is based in Chicago. I hope it's warmer there than it is in California today. It's freezing here. Donald also serves as the chairman of the Dairy Sustainability Framework and is a member of the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero Initiative, as well as a member of the UN Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock Grazing Group, Guiding Group. So thank you for being with us, Donald. And then it's truly a pleasure to welcome from Dairy UK, Dr. Judith Bryans, who's the Chief Executive of Dairy UK. Dr. Bryans is the previous president of the International Dairy Federation and is now chair of that organization's task force on the UN Food Systems Summit. So let's get started. Donald, I'm going to go to you with the first question. The global dairy community launched a very exciting Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. It's a climate initiative that was launched last year. Please tell us more about that initiative and what it means, who's a part of it, and what progress is being made. Now, if you introduced it right at the end of the year, I'll cut you a little bit of slack, but it's exciting to know that you've set some very ambitious goals. So I'm excited to hear your perspective there.
Thank you very much, Secretary Ross. And I cannot tell you what the weather is like in Chicago today because I happen to be in Rome this week. But
Goodness.
that was a very last minute change. So I'm here working on our Pathways to Dairy Net Zero initiative. And I do have a few slides I would like to share with the people attending today's summit. So if I could see my slides up, thank you very much. So as Secretary Ross said, I'm Donald Moore. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Dairy Platform, and we're one of the organizations behind a global movement called Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. Now, before I get into a discussion about the Pathways program itself, I thought I would just give you a few numbers to dimensionalize the dairy sector worldwide. Dairy is, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the world's largest agricultural commodity by value and the third largest by volume. So dairy is an exceptionally large commodity group worldwide. There are some 133 million dairy farms around the world. Now, those of us based in California or in other parts of the US, or indeed as Judith's coming from in the UK, we're probably used to dairying being a reasonably large scale operation. But the reality is that the average farm size around the world is only some 3 cows. So dairy, 133 million farms, average farm size 3 cows. There are some 600 million people living on dairy farms around the world, with a further 400 million people who derive their livelihoods upstream and downstream from the farm. So this is an industry that is exceptionally large, exceptionally diverse, and spread all over the world. If I could have my first slide, please. What I wanted to talk to you about was the journey the dairy sector has been going through in terms of the question of sustainability. Back in 2013, during the IDF World Dairy Summit in Yokohama, Japan, we launched the Dairy Sustainability Framework. It tracks the dairy sector's performance against 11 criteria covering social, economic, and environmental dimensions. Currently, it is tracking some 240 billion liters of milk worldwide, which is about 30% of total milk production in the world. But given that not all milk passes through processing plants, that 30% actually represent 50% of the world's milk supply. Next slide, please. Every year, the Dairy Sustainability Framework tracks and reports on the progress of the dairy sector globally. And I don't expect you to be able to read all the details on this slide, but you can access them at the Dairy Sustainability Framework's website. But what I did want to highlight was the following. If I could have my next slide, please. Every year, we monitor and track the prioritization around the world of those different 11 criteria. And you'll notice at the top of that list is greenhouse gas emission reductions from the dairy sector. Number 2 is animal care. Number 3, biodiversity. But you can see that for many years now, we've been able to track and monitor the progress of the dairy sector worldwide. And that led us, next slide, please, in 2018 and 2019 to work with the UN Food and Agricultural Organization to produce this report, Understanding Dairy's Emissions Worldwide. This report was, as I said, was released actually in 2019, and it tracks dairy's emissions profile over a 10-year period from 2005 to 2010 to 2015. And in that 10-year period, the emission intensity of dairy production dropped by 11%. But absolute emissions went up in that time period. And they went up because dairy increased production by a staggering 30% in that time period. And the absolute emissions went up by 18%. But the authors of the report pointed out that if the dairy sector was not making the progress it was, absolute emissions would have gone up by something like 38% because of the areas in the world that extra production was coming predominantly in the developing world. Next slide, please. That led us as a global dairy sector, and in fact, the organization that I run has got the CEOs of 9 of the world's largest dairy companies sitting on our board. And that organization said back in 2019 that it's great that we're making progress in terms of emission intensity, but we also need to focus on the absolute reductions, which led to the launch of this initiative, Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. Now, it's backed by 6 organizations: the International Dairy Federation, that Judith was the president of until recently, the International Livestock Research Institute, the IFCN Dairy Research Network, SAI Platform, the Dairy Sustainability Framework, and my own organization, Global Dairy Platform. We have as our knowledge partner the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, which is a group of some 65 countries who are pooling their academic research around greenhouse gas emissions, and we work very closely with them, and then supported very ably by the UN FAO, where I am this week. Next slide, please. In terms of the objective for this initiative, it's pretty straightforward. We want to work on how we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the dairy sector worldwide. The climate does not know boundaries. It does not know international distinctions of countries, etc. So a ton of greenhouse gas emitted in one country is the same as it would be in any other country. It all pools at a global level. And one of the things that we want to do is tackle that absolute emissions. But in order to do so, we need to be careful that we manage and understand that reducing greenhouse gas emissions cannot result in us jeopardizing food and nutrition security, nor the livelihoods and economic growth of the dairy sector. As I mentioned, the world's largest agricultural commodity by value, so we need to make sure we protect economic growth, nor can we jeopardize animal health and welfare, nor other climate and natural resource issues. So we can't trade reductions in greenhouse gas emissions off against reductions in biodiversity or water quality, etc. So it's quite a complex problem we have to solve. And in order to do that, we're developing this model based around pathways for different dairy systems. So we're developing a series of pathways that represent the different system topologies for dairy around the world. And ultimately, we want to stimulate commitments and actions. If I could have my next slide, please. We launched this initiative back in, next slide, thank you. We launched this initiative back during the Food Systems Summit last year, and then had a major presentation on it during COP26. And just give me the next slide as well. And you'll note that we've already got nearly 100 organizations signed on to this initiative. But if you didn't see your organization's name on that slide, then just join us by going to pathways-to-dairynetzero.org, and you can sign the declaration yourself. Next slide, please. So for the next steps in this particular initiative, there are 3 elements to our program. There's the research around methods, tools, and pathways, the engagement program, which is around funding and communication, and then reporting and implementation. As I mentioned before, we launched this last year. We held a major event during COP26 where we told the world that we as a dairy sector have a plan. This year, during COP27, we want to climb on the stage and talk about what we as a dairy sector are doing to implement that plan. And then at COP28, the following year in 2023, we want to be able to talk about the progress that we're making as a dairy sector. Can I have my next slide, please? And with that, I would encourage you all to join on to the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero initiative, and you can do so by going to the web address on the screen. And with that, thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Donald. That was a great introduction to really give us a global view of everything that's going on. And I'm really thrilled to see you're already talking about COP28. It's always good to have a deadline for our homework, right? So,
Absolutely.
Jenny, this is a perfect way to introduce you to get your take on how the United States is contributing to the global efforts to reduce climate emissions from the livestock sector. And specifically, how are USDA programs and strategies evolving to further assist farmers and ranchers in this particular area?
Thank you, Karen. And yeah, it's certainly a really great setting. Thank you, Donald, for your presentation. As Michael mentioned in his TED Talk at the opening, due to innovative dairy farming practices, producing what we're getting and the resources that are being used to produce each gallon of milk now versus even just 10 years ago has increased dramatically. It's really this innovation, it's sharing practices, it's piloting practices. And so recognizing all of that and the opportunity and the need for us in the United States to work with other countries, to share practices, to learn from others, and to just simply collaborate. Last summer, as part of the 2021 United Nations Food Summit, the United States launched the Coalition on Sustainable Productivity Growth for Food Security and Resource Conservation. And that's a really important thing. The coalition is aiming to accelerate the transition to more sustainable food systems through agricultural productivity growth that also optimizes agricultural sustainability across social, environmental, and economic platforms and dimensions. So it's really intended to work within each sector, so the dairy sector specifically, but then also across all the sectors too, because we know there's even a lot of partnerships there across between dairy and other sectors as well, to accelerate the sustainable productivity growth that considers impacts and trade-offs among multiple objectives. So things like food security, food safety, food affordability, which is a big topic right now, diet quality, farmer income, and farm worker income, well-being, food loss and waste, resource conservation, biodiversity, and climate change mitigation. So a really, really huge effort that's underway. To date, we have 19 countries that have signed on to this partnership. The United Nations Food and Ag Organization, of course, is also a signatory, as well as many academic and research organizations, the private sector, foundations, and other organizations. And so this is really about the platform, the coalition of groups of countries coming together to share our work, and really hopefully build on and extend international and country specific sustainability frameworks and best practices amongst all of ourselves. So that was launched last summer in Dubai. In February, Secretary Vilsack hosted another convening with the members of the coalition that were there, and to really continue to foster those conversations is a key part of that. Key to this is really, of course, the partnerships with academic and research organizations as we pilot innovation, but also the partnership, and especially the partnership also with the industry and the sectors, the people on the ground, the producers on the ground, the dairy farmers across the world who are really innovating and leading with practices, and working day in and day out to not just innovate climate practices, but also feed an important population a very, very nutritious product and dairy products. So this is a big part of what we're doing. Of course, at USDA, there's a lot of work across the department. We call it our mission areas. So we have 8 different mission areas. There's a lot of work across all of our mission areas and adaptation and adoption of climate-friendly practices as well. So that's everything from manure management practices to, of course, dairy herd health as well, because a healthy dairy and a healthy cow is going to be much more productive. Renewable energy generation is a key part, and we'll get into digester technology and the things that we're doing there in a bit too. But key again is this public-private partnership. So USDA has an MOU with the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy. This Innovation Center is working collaboratively to improve the environmental footprint of U.S. dairy. It was first initiated back in 2009 under Secretary Vilsack's term 1, that we affectionately refer to it as. So back in 2009, it's been renewed and it's currently being renegotiated. This is one that has been just really innovating the work across the dairy sector and the dairy industry for sustainability, to promote research, data, technology transfer is a very big part of that, so that we're advancing the development of practices. The Innovation Center is partially funded through the Checkoff program, so the partnership there is very key as well. Secretary Ross, you mentioned just some of the things that we're doing at USDA to really support and to harness the energy that's already happening in the dairy sector and has been happening for generations in the past. I would be remiss if I didn't talk, of course, about the work that I at NRCS, not in my mission area, but one, certainly NRCS is one that I have worked a lot with in the past, and the work that NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Services, has done to partner with dairy producers to achieve their environmental and climate and water quality and water and air objectives as well. So things like anaerobic digesters that I know you guys will talk a lot about over the next couple of days. Funding capture of manure through and the methane that comes off of that through anaerobic digesters, waste separation facilities, and product that comes out of those waste separation facilities, and the value add, and really starting to innovate there as well on just the value add of compost and other product that comes, pelletized manure, all of those different great things that can come out of waste separation. Also things like feed management, roofs and covers, waste treatment, many, many, many things that NRCS has funded. Also within NRCS, and I know later we're going to hear from sustainable conservation. And so just, really things like the conservation innovation grants are a really, really important part where USDA is funding innovation in each sector and across sectors as well. So since 2004, the conservation innovation grants have invested over $400 million in projects, one of which, of course, I think a lot of you guys are familiar with. I'm familiar with. I got to go down and visit this project a few years ago, is the Sustainable Conservation Grant that is really looking at and actually showed how important we can actually separate manure and put that water from the manure ponds back into the field through drip tape and deliver manure nutrients through drip in a way that is much more at right time, place, all of those things that we need when we're getting fertilizer right to the crop's root zone. So an incredible program there. The climate hubs are another important way that USDA is working across all of our mission areas across the department to support industry. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the drought and the work that the climate hubs are really focused on this year and always with water quality and water supply, but especially this year on water supply and drought management and innovating there. And I'll just wrap up by saying the work at Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services is also important in this space because, as I mentioned before, a healthy cow is going to produce and be much more productive, which of course more productive cattle means and certainly means that we have more milk quality and more milk coming out of the cow as well. So really just the work on animal health is very, very important, actually, in all of the work that we're doing too across the department on climate in the dairy sector. So I'll just wrap up there. And, certainly Secretary Vilsack, our Deputy Secretary Brenna, and the whole team at USDA are really engaged in this.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thanks for mentioning that SIG grant that helped Sustainable Conservation partner with dairy families. We actually set aside some of our on-farm water use efficiency funds this year to really target more dairy families being able to deploy that technology. It's exciting development, especially on the water quality in addition to emissions and energy use. Judith, you have such extensive background in working in the international arena, so I'm just thrilled to have you with us today and to learn a little bit more from you. It's not just your past role as president of International Dairy Federation, but your current role as the chair of the Task Force for Food Systems and the Summit. And so I'm really anxious to hear from you about dairy's role in the recent conversations about global food systems transformation. Exciting opportunity. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation, and greetings to everybody wherever you are in the world and whatever time it is with you. I just have a few slides to talk to as well. I have 4 slides to help me address this. So, Ian, if I could ask you to put those on the screen, thank you. I think we're all at a sustainability summit, and as a result, we have a fundamental interest in sustainability and are probably well on our way or have started along a sustainability journey. And that's fantastic. But I think it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge up front that the world is tough out there at the moment. Whether you're talking post-pandemic issues or inflation, conflict, or shocks that are happening in the world, it's not easy. And to stay on that sustainability journey is a tough one because there's a cost associated with it. But ultimately, getting to that net zero will have such a massive payoff that it's worth us staying on that path. So I'd like to encourage everybody on their sustainability journey as they go. Ian, if you could push on to my first slide, please. Thank you. And if you could start that little video for me. So the little video that you can see on the left-hand side is from NASA, and it shows global warming every year since 1880 until 2021. And while you look at that little silent video on the left, I can tell you that on the right there are 2 charts. And the one on the top shows the world's population in 1820, when that the year that video has started. And at that point, the world's population was 1 billion people. And then on the bottom chart, you can see the world's population this year. And at 7.9 billion people, we're almost topping that 8 billion people mark. So as you see the video now enter the red zone of global warming, which massively accelerated with the Industrial Revolution and has not stopped, it's easy for us to see that climate change and food security are both very much interlinked and are also a really human issue. Humanity created this issue, and humanity will find a way to solve this issue and help to slow global warming. So, Ian, if I could ask you to push on to the next slide. It's not going to be an easy journey. It's not going to be a linear trajectory. And when we talk about global food systems, then we really have to think about all of the issues that some of you may already know well. The fact that we not only have a growing world population, but we have a massive disparity from rich to poor between food availability, food affordability, and food access. And it's not just about availability to food, it's also about the quality of food that's available. Now, we have rapidly changing demographics in the world. We will soon have more older people in the world and more people who are of extreme old age than we have young people. And that will happen for the first time in history. And all adults have a right to age healthily. So the quality of their diet is tremendously important. On the other end of the age spectrum, we now know from the World Food Programme, sorry, Ian, can you back? Thank you. We now know from the World Food Programme that in 2020, school meals, school feeding, it became the largest social safety net in the world. So if we think back to that quote many years ago from Nelson Mandela about society being reflected in its way, in the way it treats its children, I guess globally we're not doing very well because we're not feeding our children correctly. There's a huge amount of people who don't have enough food, and other people who have an awful lot of food, but the quality of it may not be the best. So our challenge in this food system that dairy is part of is to ensure that we increase food production to make sure that we have enough food to feed all of those people who have a right to safe, sustainable, affordable, nutritious products, but ought to do so in a way that doesn't harm our planet. So if you can push on, Winnie, and thank you. So I guess when we come to the discussions that have happened about transformation of global systems, the United Nations Food System Summit, which happened last year but was 2 years in the making, really elevated the conversations about what food systems are, the complexity of them, and the need for them to be more resilient, the need for them to be equitable along the supply chain and actually give back to the people who were producing the food. And every country in the world is facing the same set of issues, which are summarized there on the screen. And it's a way to deliver on food security and nutrition for the growing population, support the livelihoods of those along the food production and supply chain, and contribute to sustainable food systems. But at the same time, that the food system was wonderful in elevating the discussion and getting commitments and generating coalitions, and it was absolutely fantastic. There was, without a doubt, along the way, a big challenge in terms of the misinformation and misrepresentation coming from some people who were feeding into that system. And this is where IDF and GDP, and we worked very, very closely in terms of the Food Systems Summit, and many of the dairy organizations, whether they were national associations or farming organizations, worked very hard to ensure that when we talk about food systems and when we talk about dairy, and whether we're talking to the United Nations or we're talking to policymakers in our own countries, we are discussing changes to food systems being science-led and being inclusive of the diversity of agricultural systems, not only globally, but which may be present in one country. There may be different systems in action. And acknowledge that food production is inextricably linked with people's livelihoods, with their nutrition, with individual needs, with health, and with many other areas. Because the minute that we let emotion and just the desire to do something without thinking about what that something may be, because it's emotion driven, happen, we will suffer unintended consequences, and it will cause more problems than it solves. It will actually slow us down rather than help us along our trajectory. So IDF and GASL, GDP, the World Farmers Organizations, and many others are very much involved not only on the environmental side, but also on the nutrition and on the food safety side in our work with the various UN agencies. If I can ask you to push on to my last slide, Ian. That's a great discussion to have at a global level, and the global initiatives are really important. A lot of the work done in terms of the global initiatives will be done at a national level, and they have to be done at a national level, even though the global dairy sector is very interlinked. If I think of the UK, for example, many of my members are also based in other European countries and in other countries around the world. So we're all pushing in the same direction. We started in the UK a dairy roadmap about 15 years ago in discussions with our government. And over those 15 years, we have made an awful lot of progress, but we have certainly stepped up our ambition. And one of the ways that we were able to do that was through the now collaborative discussions that are happening between policymakers, industry customers, the industry, and consumers. Because 15 years ago, while the dairy sector started moving, some of our customers, some of the retailers didn't. It was hard to get them engaged, but now everybody's engaged, and that's a benefit. So our ambition is obviously to support the need to remain below 1.5 degrees, and it's to reach net zero by 2050. We also want to have those sustained reductions in methane and nitrous oxide, and to eliminate the F gases where possible. And we may come back to some of that a little bit later on. So if I have one message for you today, it is that actually the discussions around the global food systems are not to be feared, they're to be embraced, but we need them to be based on fact, and we need people to understand that the food industry plays such a big part in people's lives that it's far more than food, and dairy has a real driving role to play. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Judith. You gave me so many thoughts during your presentation. I'm really glad that we had you. I'm going to ask the next question of both you and Donald, because you have this big picture look into things. And you've touched on it, but I really want to dive into it a little bit more about what is it about dairy and its unique role that has put it in such a leadership position, and what are the connections, perhaps you've identified some, that really mean dairy can and should lead so many efforts on climate change and sustainability.
Donald, who's going
Donald?
first?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was going to let ladies go first. So thank you again, Secretary Ross. I mean, a great question. And one of the things that we often get asked as well is how do we manage in the dairy sector to create such collaborative programs? Judith shared some of them. And the work that IDF do in school milk programs, etc., is just incredible. And dairy, I think, is somewhat unique. And to my way of thinking, you know, I joined the dairy sector only 22 years ago, so I'm a relative newcomer to dairy, but I'm still constantly amazed at how collaborative it is relative to other industries that I've worked in. And even the other livestock groups and the other agricultural groups that we talk to regularly ask, how do we manage to get these collaborations going in dairy? And I think the fundamental difference is that at its lowest common denominator, dairy is about individual farmers cooperating with their neighbors, pooling their resources to have their milk processed, etc. And that means that this ethos of cooperation exists within the dairy sector that doesn't exist in other industries. And even though I've got the CEOs of 9 of the world's biggest dairy companies sitting on the board of Global Dairy Platform, around that boardroom table, they're constantly looking for areas that they can cooperate and collaborate on. So I think first and foremost, it's that cooperative nature, that collaborative ethos that exists within the dairy sector. And then secondly, I think dairy is up for the challenge. They recognize that we, like all agricultural commodities, have to do better with our environmental performance, and we're up for that challenge. So that would be my quick answer to your question. But Judith, over
Yeah,
to you.
I was going to say something similar, but in a slightly different way. I mean, I think dairy is ubiquitous around the world, dairy farming, the consumption of dairy products. And as such, we have quite a big role in society around the world. There are very few areas that we don't touch, whether it's health, whether it's people's livelihoods, whether it's stewardship, guardianship of the land, whether it's, inputting into national economies or global economies through trade. So I think when you consider us as an industry, it's kind of hard to push forward without the engagement of the dairy sector. And dairy has a long history of collaboration, as Donald said, of working together. And we have done so in many areas in the past, whether it's making food safer, whether it's on standards for trade, and this is whether it's on nutrition, milk programs. So I think when we get right down to brass tacks, one of the reasons that the FAO signed the Dairy Declaration of Rotterdam with the IDF back in 2016, it was the recognition by them that the Sustainable Development Goals couldn't readily be achieved without dairy, and that dairy touched so many of them, whether it's gender equality, zero poverty, whatever it happens to be. And so I think we are in quite a unique position. And the other thing I think that's helpful is we're not just starting. There are many sectors who are just starting. We're not just starting. We have been working on this for some time, and we're very good at knowledge sharing. And I think we can take a role where we actually not only help ourselves, but help other sectors as well.
excellent, excellent. Jenny, I'm going to turn to you, and if you'd like to, have any response to both Donald and Judith, that'd be great. But I am curious, dairy can do everything right, but we're part of a larger agricultural community in rural areas. And your boss says it all the time, no one size fits all. But I would like to hear your perspective on how the dairy sector fits into USDA's greater vision for climate smart agriculture and its future.
Yeah, it plays a huge role. I mean, certainly a significant role. We've talked about, and Donald talked about, of course, the role and the size of dairy just globally, and of course here in the United States, it's an important part of our agricultural sector, and definitely an important part of our rural economy and our rural fabric. And so, it's in the fall, Secretary Vilsack launched the Climate Smart Commodities Initiative. And this is a really important initiative. It is, and there's a lot of similarities, I think, between the work that's been done in California with this initiative as well. Voluntary, producer driven, really focused on practices for climate smart practices. I'm not going to go into a bunch of it because I think that my colleague, Undersecretary Bonnie, will probably talk about it more later on this afternoon. But it's a really important part of the work that we're doing at USDA for climate smart practices. And dairy specifically has a huge role. The USDA has been supporting efforts like the Dairy Checkoff's Net Zero Initiative, which is a voluntary initiative. It's industry wide, working to achieve greenhouse gas reduction and neutrality, while also optimizing water usage and water quality by 2050. So this is funded through the checkoff, which I'm sure most of the folks on here watching are familiar with. But for our international colleagues, the checkoff is basically the dairy farmers pay at 15 cents per hundredweight assessment into a pool, which really is about promoting dairy products generally overall. Some of the things, certainly the Got Milk promotion, all of those different promotions, working on dairy's products in schools, all sorts of things. But it's also funding research in really important practices, for instance, the Net Zero Initiative. So the Dairy Checkoff and the Net Zero Initiative was awarded a $10 million grant from the Foundation for Food and Agriculture, which in addition to the checkoff dollars, is really advancing research in support of these 2050 net zero goals. And it's all about partnership. It always comes back to the partnership with producers. And so, for example, Trinkler Farms, actually, the innovation of California always continues. And Trinkler Dairy Farm, who is in series, was announced the first pilot farm with the Net Zero Initiative. So they will be installing new technology, really piloting a whole bunch of different climate smart practices with their effort of reducing on-farm greenhouse gas reduction by 30% by 2023. And then the dairy checkoff, working with them as a pilot, will then start to work on taking the lessons learned, both positive as well as struggles that they've had along the way, and being able to partner and advance and grow and apply those to throughout the dairy industry as a whole. So the dairy checkoff research just shows that climate is top of mind for both consumers as well as producers. And so I think the results of things like this pilot project are exactly what, when we talk about overall at USDA, the things that we want to see in the Climate Smart Commodities Initiative. The dairy industry is already leading, already innovating, and really there and playing a big part already in our climate goals. Methane is, of course, a big part of the climate work we're doing across the administration. And so this is a big part of it. There's also, of course, we can go into the renewable energy work. So in addition, of course, to the climate goals that we have just on innovating through the actual industry, the other benefits that we have across the landscape, across the United States, with things like renewable energy, transportation fuels, value-add projects are really an important piece of all of that as well. We're not just looking at the sector, but we're looking at how the sector really feeds and works with all of the other sectors across rural America.
That's great. So I love California, so I'm just going to put that on the table. I'm proud of California, but I also recognize, and you touched on this in your comments, Donald. So this wasn't in the script, but I'm just really curious to hear how is it that we work with so many very, very, very small farms where some of our technology is not going to be appropriate scale. And so I'd love to get your perspectives from around the world on that as well, Jenny, if you see some of those same challenges across the United States. So Donald, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary Ross. And you're right, not all dairy farms in the world are the same as those that we have in California or in other parts of the US. As I said at the start, the average dairy farm in the world is only 3 cows. When we started the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero initiative, we very quickly developed some, sort of rough metrics around reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from the dairy sector. 80% of the emissions in the dairy world come from the developing world. They don't come from the US or the Netherlands or New Zealand. They come out of the developing world. And the Global Research Alliance, who we're working with, came up with some rough rules of thumb. There's about a 40% reduction potential in the developing world in particular to do with practice change. So better feeding, better animal husbandry, better water practices, etc. So if we were able to, and accessing those 133 million dairy farms around the world is not the easiest thing to do, but if we were able to, we could reduce globally the greenhouse gas emissions from the dairy sector on a no regrets basis by 40%. That's phenomenal reduction. Then the next element in that model is a 35% reduction, which is to do with technologies like we're talking about here for the US, whether it's adding digesters, whether it's the methane inhibitor options that are available to us from products that have recently been launched on the market. But not all of those technologies scaled from big farms to small farms or from intensive to extensive farms. But over the next decade or two, I'm willing to bet that the price of that technology, that ability to climb in, will come down, and we'll find ways to move some of that intense technology across to extensive systems. So we have at our fingertips, if money were no object today, we have the ability to reduce GHG emissions from the dairy sector by something like 75%. But there's still a fundamental piece of research that we still need to do, that FFAR and the US Innovation Center for Dairy and others are working on, and we're working on at a global level, looking at things like how do we change the microbiota in the rumen in a cow to bring down emissions? How do we selectively look at breeding technologies, etc.? So phenomenal opportunities out there, but accessing that first 40% reduction globally is all about getting to small farms as well. And we've proven with programs like Dairy Nourishes Africa that we can do that in countries like Tanzania. In a 9-month period, we managed to, in our pilots, reduce emission intensity by over 30%. So we know it can be done.
Excellent. Judith, what would you like to add to that?
I think it's quite important that we consider the fact that whether you have 2 cows or whether you have 100 cows or 10,000 cows, most of the dairy farms in the world are run by they're family owned. And I think, very often when we have discussions about food systems, people only focus on the smallholder farmers. And the smallholder farmers are very important for local food security. But the family farmers are probably not the ones who are going to feed the world and its growing population. So I think we have to find a way, and I'm not sure I have the answer to it, but I think we have to find a way to balance out the discussions about the emissions that can be reduced because of changes in practices versus people thinking that bigger farms are bad, because that's something that we often hear. And I guess that's not true. I think we have to embrace that whole diversity of farming systems. And one of the things that we can do is the knowledge sharing. It doesn't mean that we have to try and push how we farm onto people who are in different countries where what we do just won't fit for them. But it does mean that where we've made mistakes, we can share what we've learned from that so that the same mistakes aren't done again.
Excellent. Jenny, did you want to add from a USDA perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really important is, and we've really been focused on equity at USDA. It's certainly one of our pillars, and making sure there's equitable access to programming that USDA offers, but technical assistance is a key part of that. It's not just technical assistance for access to funding, but also just implementation of practices. Someone there, the state conservationist, the soil conservationist, working directly with producers is key. One of the first things I did in my position when I started was work with the Northeast dairy farmers, and a group of them, especially the small ones, the very, very small ones that we're talking about here, because of how far they are from a processor, because of the volume that they're producing. It just didn't make sense for their current processor to continue their contract, and so they were dropped. And so working with them on finding solutions, because that product and that dairy product, is a very valuable one, but also, again, we will achieve our climate goals if we're making sure that everything that is produced is actually making it to market as well. So the Dairy Business Innovation Centers are a really important part of that. So we funded another $80 million in that. Actually, Fresno State just got stood up as a new Dairy Business Innovation Center. So now we have one here in California as well. But there's that Vermont, and visited with them last month just on the work that they're doing, especially with the small dairies on creating value add product, finding ways, working on improving roads so that they can get their product to market, find new processors as well. So it's also about looking at the markets and making sure that there's access to markets as well, especially for small producers. But it all goes back down to technical assistance and on the farm support for producers as well.
That's great. So I want to shift to nutrition security, which you touched on, especially in your comments, Judith, because it's so important to help people. Really, they get so disconnected from their food system that they forget that we can do all this on climate, but we can't sacrifice food production and nutrition security. And so I get, this may not be a fair question, but I would love to know if you were orchestrating COP28, which will be in Egypt, I believe in Cairo, right? Having just come back from Dubai, and where they talk about food security every day, how would you bring agriculture and leaders from the dairy sector in to be able to help the rest of the world see nutrition security and reducing methane emissions are things that we can do together. How would you raise the visibility of agriculture's role? And I think should be even more visible than they were at the Glasgow meeting myself, but that's just my personal opinion. Donald, I'm going to kick it off to you, but then I want to really hear on the nutrition side in particular what Judith would have to add to that.
Yeah, I was looking forward to Judith's answer to this.
Okay, well, we can go to
Um,
Judith.
Go to Judith
Okay.
and come back to me.
Okay.
Judith's our nutrition expert.
Well, I actually agree with you on COP in Glasgow. I think there was a lot of talk about climate change and not enough talk about food. And I certainly hope that in the next COP that comes up way more. But for me, there is total disconnect. And as the world continues to urbanize, there will be an increased disconnect between people and their food. We see it here in the UK. When you ask children where milk comes from, they say Tesco's. That is the truth, and it's terrifying. But so in order to bring the world leaders together, I think one of the things that is very important is that we sometimes forget, sometimes our world leaders are disconnected from food too. And bringing them together to talk about that interconnection between the climate change aspects and the food aspects is tremendously important. And I think some people take for granted the fact that nutrition is understood. It's understood that milk is good for you, but that's not true. That's been eroded over the years. And as nutrition education has been eroded over the years in schools, that's been eroded. I am terrified when I hear people talking about procurement of food in schools these days, because it's all about let's procure food based on sustainability. But what does that mean to you? What about the nutrition? Who's going to decide on those externalities? And I hear those discussions in many, many countries.
Yes.
And I really think that there is a need to bring together both the environmentalists, the economists, and the nutritionists all in the one room to have some of those discussions, to have a more rounded discussion. On the ground, I think we're very lucky in dairy in that we have many good nutrition programs across national associations. In California, you've got Dairy Council of California. I have been blessed to visit them. I understand the school program is absolutely fabulous. And certainly when we had an IDF event where we showcased school milk programs, Tammy from Dairy Council of California and our colleagues in India gave two fabulous presentations, two very different countries, but two parts of the world where people were really trying to both educate and feed. So that was my long-winded way of saying it needs the economists and the environmentalists and the nutritionists in the room.
And bring them all together around really good, nutritious food as a great way to start the dialogue and make it real. I think we're running out of time, but I want to get Donald. I'll give you a couple minutes, and Jenny, and then we're going to wrap it up. But thank you so much.
Yeah.
I love the idea of nutrition and food being a part of the next COP.
You know, this is a complex problem that we have to solve. But the first thing we've got to do is we've got to get world leaders to understand that agriculture is different to greenhouse gas emissions from burning fossil fuel, etc. Agriculture is different because it is both a source and a sink of greenhouse gas emissions. The only other industry that comes close to it is forestry. So put agriculture and forestry together, everything else is different. So you need to start treating this sector as different. And a calorie from dairy is not the same as a calorie from, some other food stuff. Dairy comes with a highly loaded nutritional package that you don't get from many other things. And I am staggered constantly at the people who think that we can just substitute a calorie here with a calorie there and it's nutritionally the same. It's not. So Judith's done a great job of promoting the need for a better understanding of the actual nutritional profile of foodstuffs around the world. And I'll just back up one of the things Judith said. We need to start educating children about where their food actually comes from. When I was a kid growing up, we all knew a farmer. Nowadays, when I kids, younger people, they have no idea where it comes from, and they're too quick to latch on to what I would think of as without actually understanding the implications. Your food system is a complex Rubik's Cube. You remember the old Rubik's Cube? You've got nutrition, you've got environment, you've got economic, you've got social outcomes, and balancing those and getting them all lined up is not simple. And people are looking, unfortunately, in today's world, people look for simple answers, and they don't exist in this.
Points very well made. Live it every day. Jenny.
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, Secretary Vilsack is passionately focused on nutrition security. We all know that the pandemic has brought health disparities and just a really important need to really adjust those health disparities with healthy food access. This is part of the administration's goal for advancing racial equity, is making sure that all communities have access to, as Donald mentioned, that not just calorie rich, but nutrient rich food. And so that's a key thing. So we have 4 equities as part of our work on nutrition security. One is, of course, nutrition access, nutrition assistance programs, nutrition education and promotion efforts, as Judith talked about as well, dietary guidelines and translating those dietary guidelines for Americans, and then other efforts, really important efforts like the Gus Schumacher program, are also part of that. Some of the work that we're doing, taking again, really the lessons that we learned, the things we saw over the past year in the pandemic, is some of the things that we're really focused on. So we just in the fall announced a local food purchasing assistance program. This is one I know, Karen, you guys are working on. It's in partnership with states and tribal governments. So we'll do cooperative agreements with all the states. It's really about connecting the dots a lot more, connecting the local food provider, whether that is at the local dairy or another food provider, and connecting that to our procurement programs, and particularly our feeding programs at food banks, pantries, schools, and the like. And really, again, it's fostering those shorter chains of connections so that we're getting local produced food into the hands and the mouths of the people who really need it most. We're doing that also. We're doing another program for local food schools, particularly on cooperative agreements, again, through the states. It's a really, again, what I like about this is we do a lot, and we must continue to do a lot at USDA on purchasing food and making sure that food is getting into schools. But there's the community and the cultural connection that sometimes can get missed through those. And so these programs really help to foster that community, build those cultural connections, and really start to get the food that the farmers are producing just nearby into schools, into food banks, and really strengthening those types of platforms.
That's great. I have to tell you, I have 80 more questions, and I'm getting an earworm telling me that we're running out of time. I have enjoyed this discussion so much, and I want to thank each of you for your important contributions to this. Great way to kick off the day. And I look forward to meeting all of you, Jenny, again soon, and Donald and Judith. I really look forward to opportunities to collaborate with you. I appreciate your leadership. I appreciate what all of your organizations are doing, and the fact that we can do this together. Partnerships are always going to make a difference in a very positive way. So thank you all very much. I can hear everybody applauding already. It was so fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.